Hello and welcome to Our American States, a podcast from the National Conference of State Legislatures. This podcast is all about legislatures, the people in them, the policies, process, and politics that shape them. I'm your host, Ed Smith.
I'm someone who came from the National Institute of Drug Abuse. That's my training. I did not come to cannabis like, oh, this is going to be great. I came to it assuming it was going to be negative and harmful for the most part. And I have, through my own data, and science is, suggests your data are what your data are, and it's not showing me that.
That was Michael Sophis, the Director of Research for the Cannabis Public Policy Consulting Firm, a firm that does extensive surveying around public policy affecting cannabis. While cannabis remains illegal under federal law, states have regulated cannabis for nearly 30 years. But policymakers have had few evidence-based policy tools to inform them. More than two-thirds of the states and territories regulate cannabis for medical use, and more than 20 states and territories allow for non-medical adult use. With that in mind, I wanted to talk with Sophis about what his research has found. He's one of the few researchers looking at the policy issues of concern to lawmakers. He discusses some of the surprises from his findings, the questions states are trying to answer, and explains why the cannabis black market still does a brisk business, even in places where it's legal. You can learn more about policy issues surrounding cannabis during the session Growing Fields of Data, Public Health and Cannabis Policy at NCSL's Legislative Summit, August 3rd, from 1:30 to 2:45 p.m. at the Colorado Convention Center in Denver. Here's my discussion with Dr. Sophis. Dr. Sophis, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks. Appreciate it. Glad to be here.
Well, thanks for coming on the show. And to start, could you talk about your cannabis policy research and why it might be of interest to lawmakers?
Yeah, so our work, essentially we collect data from tens of thousands of people across the United States, across many, many states, and within states with over 200 different cannabis outcomes. So these are things ranging not just from, how much you're using, grams or the frequency or the potency, the methods of use, but we're talking market outcomes, public health outcomes, things like cannabis use disorder, psychosis, other things like that. And then we bring in other data from state policies that we basically program into one big database. So these sub-state policies and regulations, and then we essentially look at these surveys 4 times a year, and we evaluate what happened, and then what will happen when not just is adult use legalization passed, but what happens when the excise tax is this much? What happens if you add 2 more licensees per capita in state X? What we do is we model these sorts of policy outcomes using statistics and predictive modeling, and it allows us to basically say, okay, what are all the good things that happen if you engage in or implement policy X? Does CUD go up or down? Does the percentage of regulated cannabis go up or down? What happens to social equity? Is your social equity program are there more applicants? Is there no change, right? And just literally kind of adding this together and making a common sense interpretation of, is the public, is society in general benefiting clearly from this policy? And then you can kind of go from there in terms of whether or not it gets implemented. That's really what a lot of our research is focused on, is kind of evaluating what's happening there. Essentially, when these certain things are, let's say they take policy X or policy Y, let's say it's a cap on the number of dispensaries allowed in the state. We can model what kind of impact that is, and then broadly start to inform specific states, sometimes even specific counties or localities, and then maybe even the U.S. at large in terms of what the best courses of actions are to maximize outcomes for folks.
So if we talk specifically about public health and safety kind of questions, looking at your data and the analysis you've done, what kind of questions do you think legislators might have that these data could answer?
The most common ones I've seen in some of the proceedings, at least at the federal level, but I think also at the state level, having talked to many state legislators and policy folks, is what does legalization do? Kind of air quotes legalization, right? Because it's obviously a little more complex than that. But what does that do to these outcomes? Does it increase youth use? Does it increase cannabis use disorder? Does it increase psychosis? And then, sometimes the more complex ones, okay, well, maybe there's higher potency because of legalization. How does that in turn impact, right, those sorts of public health outcomes? That's usually the kind of questions that we get that are strictly sort of focused on public health.
So when you regulate any industry, you're balancing between what is going to be in the best interest, particularly in terms of health and safety of the citizenry, and not stifling economic development. And that's certainly the case with marijuana. When you look at policymakers, how can they use this data science to inform those decisions where they're not really tamping down the market unnecessarily, but still making sure that they're looking out for the health and safety of their citizenry?
Yeah, I think when you collect all this data together and you have these thousands and thousands and thousands of people and you're doing it 4 times a year, so you're getting seasonal, regular updates on this and looking at states, looking at sub-state areas in the whole country, what it allows you to do is basically figure out simulating these sorts of outcomes. Let's say, for example, I'm going to give you an example. Like in Rhode Island, we did this for a conference recently where we simulated the number of dispensaries per capita because they do have an actual license cap. There's only so many licensees, stores, dispensaries, depending on your state, that can actually be present, or active in their adult use market that's going to be emerging here. What we did was we said, okay, well, what happens, if you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to, I think it was like 45 or 50, which for Rhode Island, being as small as it is quite a few. And said, okay, well, basically what we found was, once it got to like 13 or 14, the actual effect on the percent of regulated use, which is important because illicit use and illicit like sales is associated with a lot of negative outcomes, not just in terms of like safety and crime outcomes, in addition to health-related outcomes. But it also for the industry to succeed, it's also important for that regulated use percentage to be up, right? And so we saw that it went up and up and up, and then it just flattens out, like just beautifully flattens out to where you add a store, you're not getting anything when it comes to breaking down that into the illicit market anymore. And so then it becomes, well, why do that, right? As a state, they're going to pay more money in administrative costs and fees, and it's going to be more complicated. And then it's most likely that if you keep pushing, when you're not getting any good outcomes with that, you are eventually going to hit more negative public health outcomes if you just keep adding stores and dispensaries. So that's a good example, I think, of where you can kind of maximize where no one's really losing, everyone's basically winning there.
Yeah, that's really interesting that it would just max out at a certain point. And as I mentioned in our earlier conversation here in Colorado, I think we've got more pot shops than Starbucks at this point. So for policymakers, what would be the best, if you were to name a few of the data sources or analyses that policymakers should want to look at on a regular basis? You're saying you're doing this analysis 4 times a year. What should the regulators be looking at? What are the real key indicators for them to keep an eye on?
See, that's a fantastic question. I mean, I'm biased because, to my knowledge, no one else is measuring this much data this frequently at this large of a level. And so the tough part is if you measure an outcome itself, let's say it's, cannabis psychosis cases or youth risk, or even just like market health of market outcomes, things that are just saying, okay, the market's doing great, whatever. Anytime you take one of those outcomes or even multiple at a time, that by itself kind of means nothing because it's so, for example, there are dozens of news stories where there was a recent New York Times one where it was inferred that increases in potency, there was increases in like accidents sort of like maladaptive outcomes related to like youth use or issues like with product use and things like that. It's just instantly linked to legalization because, of course, states have legalized more over time. But that's a huge leap that more often than not is just wrong. It has no impact in many cases, and in a lot of cases has in some cases it even has the opposite impact people think. In other words, it's actually lower risk of some of these negative outcomes in more legal states, like states that have adult use, for example. And so I think it's really what they need to understand relationships between outcomes, between policies and outcomes. And ideally, they're not just looking to track those, they're looking to predict them ahead of time with working with folks like us where they can actually figure out, okay, this is very likely going to go up a lot. But if we can implement this policy or reduce the excise tax or whatever is the appropriate outcome, and then what we try to do is help them actually implement it. We started as a purely consulting firm working with states and building the legalization, their legal team, and really standing up a legal market. We then help them get stakeholder consensus and talk to the public and all these different stakeholders that are involved and actually help enact or implement that policy. So it's sort of meant to be like a full-scale solution. But to answer your question, we think it's about understanding these relationships between a policy and in multiple outcomes of interest, but doing so beforehand so they can take measures to actually prevent it or improve it.
Well, I think you make a great point that the dearth of research in this area has been vast compared to the amount of activity that's gone on at the state level in terms of legalization. What do you think at the federal level, what would help them to understand this policy, which whether it's legal at the federal level or not is nonetheless a significant presence in the society and a lot of state regulators looking out for health and safety?
That's a really interesting question because it's really about the behavior of those individuals, right? And what motivates or impacts or really influences them. The thing I would say personally, and I think from our company, is that we are seeing increasingly that adult use is associated with both, like when you compare states that have it versus those that just do med, and even within the states that have adult use is so folks that are using adult use versus say folks that are using, getting from a dealer or other sources, right, is associated with lower cannabis use disorder and lower driving under the influence. There was another paper that came out recently showing something almost identical to what I'm saying, and it was, with driving under the influence, it was, the lowest was in adult use states, then medical states, and it was the highest in states where it was illegal. There's starting to come out this data where there's been these sort of conceptions for a long time, right? Where I think President Biden at one point came out when he was running for president saying, "Oh, medical's fine, but recreational's, and it just no founding for that sort of evidence. And if anything, we're seeing the opposite. That when it's made into adult use market or implemented in adult use market, I think we're starting to see it turn the corner where it might even be safer in some contexts. One of the things I'm trying to do, because I know there's a lot of talk that Republicans are going to be sort of moving into office potentially. There's a lot of predictions of that. Is I'm trying to connect the market outcomes. I just did an analysis for a state client where I showed, okay, this is going to be every dispensary was I forget 24, 25 new jobs, and they're going to get paid on average, according to our data, this much. And then you start multiplying that. I mean, that has profound implications for local, and you start adding the economic outcomes and associated with, okay, we're not seeing any more harms. Maybe that could convince them that this might be a net win.
Well, certainly the economic effects they're significant. I mean, it depends on, when you look at Colorado, I can't remember exactly how much money it was, but the amount of money, when you look at it, seems to be enormous. But then when you look at what percentage of the state budget revenue it is, so you can get people arguing either way on it. But you're right. I mean, if the research tends to point toward better outcomes with legalization, as well as some economic benefit, that's an interesting data point for people to consider. Let me ask you about this study you did in Maine for the Office of Cannabis Policy. I read that and I was fascinated by it, just the kinds of things you were looking at. And I wondered what it was the state was most interested in.
Yeah, so I think with Maine, they were really interested in understanding sort of public health outcomes and market supply and demand across various sources. So they really wanted to know how much illicit cannabis was being purchased or accessed in the state, ideally sort of how that was relating to public health related outcomes. And actually, one of the more I think convincing displays that I've ever seen is that more illicit use is associated with, for every gram of illicit use, you are experiencing significantly more issues related to cannabis use disorder, the prevalence of driving under the influence, and even I think days of smoking tobacco as well. And so I think it's really important that people understand this is a good example, kind of that net win-win. The market can benefit there by reducing the illicit market, and they have done a good job of doing so there. And then in turn, that's probably helping public health outcomes too.
Well, one of the things in there that I was interested in was talking about the illegal people who are buying it illegally, and that Maine seemed to actually be, from your research, on the lower end. I guess my question is, why do people buy pot illegally if they can buy it legally? And maybe that's a stupid question.
And I'm telling you, that is a brilliant question. And you'd be surprised that I've almost never been asked that. I'm not sure if I've been asked that more than maybe once ever. Because people have asked me, why do they admit to that? But I think the more interesting question is, why do they do it? So the obvious reason, and basically is price. So we essentially said, look, once we did some analytics and said, look, once it gets to 1020, 1025 per gram for adult use, you're going to see things just, as it gets closer to that, people are going to jump in switch over to illicit. In the 5 months since we did that data collection, their illicit has either price dropped right to 10.25, and now it's like, they've had to go fantastic first quarter this year. And so I think that the price is a big part of it. The other thing we're finding is that folks who are using illicitly, there may be something going on with sort of a trust in government, or sort of not wanting to be a part of that enterprise. And we think it could have something to do with social equity related, people who are on drugs, the whole that sort of thing. And I think there's something there where they just don't trust the government, and they don't want to sort of benefit it, if you will, by purchasing from there. And when we've done analyses on these, that's kind of what we saw where, I told you about that flattening out, where like if you add licensees or just stores, you weren't really seeing that much after a while. You sort of hit like what's called an asymptote, where it just sort of flattens out. You don't see that increase in the percentage of regulated sales. And so here, I think part of that is because there's a good chunk of folks that are holding on because it's part of, there could be also cultural things going on, but I think there's some trust trust in government, or, let's say anti-government, but not trusting government in this context for, to be honest, understandable reasons, I think.
Thanks, Dr. Sophos. We're going to take a quick break and then come back with the rest of our discussion.
This year's NCSL Legislative Summit brings you a terrific lineup of speakers that you won't want to miss, including Kevin O'Leary, fresh out of the Shark Tank, 5-time Olympic gold medalist Missy Franklin, 2-time world champion adventure racer and San Diego firefighter Robin Benincasa, founder of the Cook Political Report, Charlie Cook, the director of the U.S. Census Bureau, Robert Santos, astronaut Matthew Dominic, who will discuss NASA's new moon mission, the Artemis Project, author of Molly's Game, Molly Bloom, former Major League manager Clint Hurdle, famed storyteller Donna Washington, and a profound session on the Christmas truce of 1914 during World War I, presented by Kurt Stedron. Don't miss meeting these and other exciting speakers at the summit, which takes place August 1st through the 3rd. Register now at www.ncsl.org/summit. That's www.ncsl.org/summit.
I'm back with Dr. Michael Sophos of Cannabis Public Policy Consulting. One thing that I know was challenging to lawmakers when these cannabis laws first went into effect was the issue of how to determine if someone was driving under the influence of cannabis. Is there an agreed upon standard for determining if someone is under the influence now?
No, I went to a great conference about 3 to 4 weeks ago, basically, multi-day exclusively about this with, leaders in tech, leaders in research, state regulators, the whole kit and caboodle, a ton of, attorneys, prosecutors. And it was a lot of circular conversations because there really isn't a consensus because, I think there's a general consensus amongst experts that, zero tolerance and per se laws are not great, probably aren't very effective. And I do think a lot of the, drug recognition experts do a very good job and combine a lot, focusing on impairment, not on just what's THC's in your blood, because we know that, impairment and THC are actually quite poorly correlated often. And so it can create negative negative situations in terms of marginalizing those who have already been marginalized, when being pulled over and things like that. And it's just not accurate. Using that as evidence is understandable at the end of a long series of process from when someone would be pulled over all the way to, if they were processed, or at least taken back to be examined in terms of that more biological side of things. But it's the per se laws and zero tolerance are generally, I think most would consider not great, but they're kind of already there. And so it's unclear to me how that would get reversed in those states, to be honest.
Well, that's interesting. So it really is sort of right where it was.
So there is technology emerging that sort of the great hope, if you will, is the technology that's emerging. So there's a couple leaders that I think have the best bet of actually being a highly scientifically validated, court admissible, full-fledged approach. And the one is rapid eye tracking. So if you look at studies on DREs, these drug recognition experts, the eye-related stuff is already the most predictive already. And rapid eye tracking is, think of it as like multi-millisecond video tracking of the eye. So it's much more detailed, many more measures. And so there's a lot of building evidence that maybe that could be a really great solution, and maybe even be able to identify THC versus other drugs, which obviously would have benefits in the context of a court scenario. The other one that's really interesting, and I'm going to butcher the full name, I think it's functional near infrared spectroscopy. Actually, I think I got that right. It's really fancy nerd for just like a portable fMR, like neuroimaging. That's more or less what it is. The idea there again is that, if you're measuring abnormal blood flow in certain parts of the brain, at least externally, it's not invasive. Neither of these are invasive. They're just to be quick. There's a couple of studies out of Harvard's Mass General Hospital doing that are showing promising findings. The idea is that you have to be able to identify this in one trial. With hockey players and concussions, right? They have a baseline for them at the beginning of the year using like a cognitive test, and then they go back and give them a cognitive test right after they get hit too hard, and they know, okay, this person's probably has an issue here in terms of a concussion. You can't do that with cannabis because you can't give the whole population that drives cognitive tests. So it's a real challenge in that sense. So these more like cognitive and biological measures integrated together have the best potential to actually identify things accurately and quickly and not invasively.
Now, you've already mentioned a few findings that are kind of counterintuitive, I think, to a lot of us. I'm just wondering what other interesting or surprising things you found in your research that kind of goes against the popular belief, such as the notion that in the adult use states that there seems to be less of these bad outcomes in the states where nothing is legal.
So I think there's two things here. The first is that this is actually really important for a lot of stuff we've talked about today so far, which is cannabis use. And oftentimes if any substance use goes of any type of substance, if the use goes up, frequency, amount, whatever, at a population level, there's going to be some extra risks of harm. It's kind of intuitive, right? But cannabis use is going up across the country. It's illegal states, med, adult use, doesn't matter. That's a really important point I think people should know. It's not just with my research. This is dozens and dozens of other papers showing this in federal data sets, other data sets, showing this. I think it's important. In other words, just because as a regulator or legislator or any other stakeholder in a state, just because you don't have legal cannabis doesn't mean people aren't using it. A lot of these states, millions of people are still using illicitly, in some states at least. Based on our data, using in that fashion is more dangerous, in general. I think that's the first thing I would tell. Some folks may find that intuitive, some might not. The other one I'd say is we're starting to see stuff that suggests, I kind of alluded to this a little bit before, that medical cannabis can be more challenging. It can have sort of be more of a double-edged sword, because there are obviously conditions where it's fantastic. It has very legitimate health benefits, documented, health benefits, and other ones where they're showing promising benefit. But there's very, very, very few people who actually use cannabis as a medical cannabis patient do not also use recreationally. And it's also extremely common that they use cannabis for other conditions that they haven't met qualifications for or recommendations for. And so it becomes this thing where, when it becomes this, it's a medicine, but then it's also not because you're using recreationally, and it's an approved medicine and it's not. They're using their medical cannabis instead of prescribed medications. It becomes challenging, right? And a lot of people aren't going to like a primary care provider or a doctor or nurse physician even. It becomes very challenging, and we're seeing more harms associated with that. And even if you control for like their health conditions in the first place, so it's not necessarily that they're not as healthy to begin with. Even if you control for that, that can be an issue. And so I think it's important people understand that. And that could be part of what we're seeing with adult use being potentially associated with the best outcomes in some cases.
What's the next area for research, the next 5 years? What questions do you want to answer that you haven't been able to answer yet?
So that's a really good one. I think like the one that's been on my mind a lot is to what extent, or is there a single, generally speaking, I know this is like impossible to be a perfect version of this, but is there generally one format for the most part that is the format to implement in terms of like going from illegal to all the way to legalization of adult use? And then there's a bunch of sub questions. Do you just put med right with adult use? Do you put it all at once? Do you make med a subset of adult use? Do you how much lag, if any, do you put between the two, right? And then, obviously, dispensaries per capita and this and that. There's a bunch of things you can talk about. But I guess what I'm really curious about, let me give you an example. In Maine, right, we saw this effect, right, where for every gram of adult use, you really weren't seeing relationships with these other negative outcomes. But for every gram of illicit, you were seeing higher likelihood of these negative outcomes, right, like a stronger relationship. And like literally this morning, I replicated that finding for the most part, essentially, with both cannabis use disorder and driving under the influence with nine total adult use states, suggesting that maybe these states aren't that different after all in terms of once you really collect all the data and you really start isolating things, maybe they're not that different. But I don't know. Maybe those adult use states may have something in common. 20 years from now, if we get 5 states from the Southeast that all have adult use, that could look very different. And so the question is if and kind of where these states might differ in terms of how these relationships look like. Will we have to go into a state and do completely different policy simulations or give them completely different advice based on the policy simulations because people there are different, or their use is different, or the environment's different, or what have you. I think that's kind of one of the biggest, existential questions. And that has, I think, profound implications for federal legalization, for how much oversight or lack thereof should there be at the federal level. And that should largely depend on how consistent or heterogeneous the data is, how different states are, or how similar they are.
Well, that's interesting because it makes sense that it's going to take a fairly long period of time with a lot of groups, different population areas in this country to really come to conclusions that are valid. I always like when I have an expert on this show to ask them as we wrap up to tell legislators who are in this space, whether they're in a legal use state already or whether their state might be looking at that. What are some of the key takeaways? What are the key things that they should look at?
That's a really good one. Yeah, I think my advice would be, like I said, making sure that they're getting data, that they're looking at relationships in the policies and the data. If I could tell these people, show them that we're talking about actually reducing harms and potentially having a real shot here. If you work with the data here, maybe even it's very likely that you can reduce harms, public health harms of cannabis, and make more state revenue and help employment and GDP and literally all of it. And I'm someone who came from the National Institute of Drug Abuse. That's my training. I did not come to cannabis oh, this is going to be great. I came to it assuming it was going to be negative and harmful for the most part. And I have through my own data and science is, suggests your data are what your data are. And it's not showing me that, and I guess that's what I would want them to take is it shouldn't be considered a politically taboo. I mean, the numbers are overwhelming for support in both parties in terms of the citizens. And it could be a cross-topic issue that I think politicians could benefit from supporting and if they take a data-driven approach.
Well, this has just been a fascinating conversation, and I know that an awful lot of legislators are very interested in this research. So thanks so much for taking the time to share this with us. Take care.
Thank you so much, Ed.
And that concludes this episode of our podcast. We encourage you to review and rate NCSL podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Pocket Casts, Stitcher, or Spotify. We also encourage you to check out our other podcasts, Legislatures, The Inside Story, and the special series, Building Democracy. Thanks for listening.